for you.
Oh yeah, you did tell us.
Yeah, and then that film took a while to load, so I've just, after class, I've got to run to the supermarket, and then when I get home I'll put that film up on Blackboard so that you can take a look at it and do your analysis. You've got tomorrow's lab and Friday's lab to work on looking at that film, if that's okay with you.
That's fine.
Okay. All right. Well, it's 9:35. I don't want to wait any longer, so I'm going to get going. If you have questions, jump in and ask, okay? We're going to finish chapter, where are we? Weeks. Chapter 6, I think it is, right?
Yes, I think it is.
I've got the wrong number on my spreadsheet. And we had done throwing, and we started looking at kicking. So I think we got to here. And my plan, this PowerPoint has throwing, kicking, punting, striking. So I'm going to skip the punting. You can look at that on the slides and in the book. There is a developmental sequence, there is an observation plan for punting, so it's worth taking a look at that just to keep working on this observation plan idea. Okay. All right, so we had looked at early kicking. We'd watched that little bit of film of the girl in the pink dress towing the ball and the rather chunky young boy in the orange shirt not running and kicking the ball, right? So again, all the mechanical principles here are the same idea as for throwing, all right? What we want to do is to apply as much force, typically, again, not if I'm throwing the dart, right? So we were looking at the difference between throwing for force and throwing for accuracy. But typically, what we're looking to do in a game is kick the ball as hard as we can, right? So we want to apply as much force as possible to the ball normally. Even, I think, I've never played soccer, but I would say in soccer there might be a little bit of that accuracy force trade-off if you're kicking a penalty kick, because you want to kick that ball hard so that it's more difficult for the goalie to stop it, but at the same time you want to hit your target in the net. So I think with penalty kicks, same with rugby. I don't know much about American football. And rugby, the penalty kick isn't taken from the same place every time like it is in soccer, like they've got that circle. In rugby, it depends where the penalty was made. So some rugby penalty kicks are closer to the uprights and some are further away. So you've got to keep thinking about all this mechanical stuff when we're looking at the development of the skill. So proficient kicking, again we want some trunk rotation, but we're also looking at what is that kicking leg doing. All right, if you remember in chapter 3, we said we want a long swing in, right? So we want that foot way back, bent, lots of hip extension, right? That's why soccer players tend to get a lot of groin strains because they don't stretch enough, and you've got this really big extension to kick the ball hard, okay? The trunk rotates and the thigh moves forward and then the leg will kick. Remember, at the point of contact, foot to ball, that we want that leg as straight as possible, but we want to keep it bent through the swing, and then the timing of straightening it is really important. All right? And the arms should be moving in opposition. So sometimes you'll see run in and there's almost a leap. If you watch a really elite soccer player, there's almost a leap into the kick. So that's something to look for. That's an instance where leaping transfers into a sports skill. We want full range of motion at the hip, okay? And I'm not going to play that next bit of film. You can have a look at that, but if you look at this picture, there's leaning back, quite a good swing through here, all right? And then what you want to look for when you watch this video is that leg straight when this individual makes contact with the ball, right? So we don't have, unlike throwing, we don't have very much research on the development of kicking. We know the overall kind of picture, the overall pattern, but we don't have the changes in the pattern from a beginner to a more professional person. So we don't have these stages really well developed. We've got kicking on the fundamental motor skill chart for MSU. So we've got some idea of what happens early on, but then we don't have a lot of detail with what's happening. So we don't have, for example, a developmental sequence for kicking. We don't have an observation plan for kicking in the book because that's just not a skill that people have looked at closely at in the past. So we don't have validated developmental steps for kicking, but from what we do know, kicking doesn't appear to be automatic. So when we look at older children, teenagers, adults, we don't see proficiency. What is going on with? That's very strange. We don't see proficiency in older children, adults, unless they've done a lot of kicking and had good coaching and teaching on it. Especially when we're kicking for distance, then that force generation is probably the key. So the coordinated pattern of the leg bend, the leg straightening, the segmented rotation, that's all going to elicit quite a significant change. So if you, I guess it depends how you would define, what is going on? My browser's doing all kinds of weird and wonderful things. I'm not sure if soccer players would consider dribbling kicking.
I'm sorry, Dr. Walt. Did it just go out on your thing? Because on my end it was reconnecting, so I couldn't hear you.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it's been playing around.
Okay. I can see.
Can you see it now? I don't know whether it disconnected and reconnected this end. It says it's still, oh, we have audio issues. No, what is going on here? Interesting. Can you hear me now?
Yes, ma'am. Now I can hear you.
Okay,
It's kind of going in and out.
yeah. Where did you lose me?
You showed the video. Well, we didn't play the video.
Yeah,
And after that,
showed you the picture of the video?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yes, ma'am.
okay. So let me start this slide again then. Just in case it didn't record either. So kicking doesn't have a validated, there's nowhere near the amount of research on kicking that there is on throwing. So we don't have a validated sequence, we don't even have a hypothetical developmental sequence and observation plan for kicking in the book. So we don't have one of those yes-no question observation plans for kicking. So we know the overall picture, kind of the overall pattern, but we don't have that detail of the developmental change in the components of kicking. So on our MSU chart and on the TGMD, we have fundamental kicking, and we've got some breakdown of stages for very fundamental kicking, but once we get outside fundamental, we don't have much information at all. So we don't know what the qualitative change in the components of kicking look like. Okay, so it doesn't seem to be an automatic skill. So many of these more sport type fundamental skills just don't develop without practice and good instruction. So if we can look at adults or teenagers, and unless they've had practice and good instruction, their kicking is not proficient, right? We would probably be able to place them on one of our fundamental stages, which we shouldn't be able to do with teenagers and adults, right? They should be proficient at all these skills. So it's thought that maybe generating force is the key, particularly when we're looking at kicking for distance. And if you ask people to kick for distance, we see a significant change. Just like if we ask people to throw for distance, we see this very different attempt at the motor pattern. Now, I'm not a soccer player, I've never played soccer. I don't know whether soccer players would think of dribbling as a form of kicking. In my head, because I don't have any experience with that sport, dribbling to me seems like an accurate form of kicking. And so dribbling looks very, very different to kicking for distance, in the same way that that dart video we watched, throwing for accuracy, looks very, very different to throwing for distance. Okay? So, a soccer player may tell me I'm completely wrong, considering dribbling to be a version of kicking, but that's how I visualize it in my head. Okay? So what we want to question then is, how do we design? If I'm the teacher, the coach, how do I design activities that are developmentally appropriate for kicking? All right, so I have to think about, what do I need to do for a beginner? Okay, well, we know that there's a lot of perception involved in kicking. So we want to keep the ball stationary to begin with, okay? And then we've got options. Once once we want to start to move the ball, we've got lots of different options. I can move the ball side to side. I can move the ball front to back, right? So I can play around with the direction that the ball is moving in, that they have to try to judge to kick, all right? Later on in the semester, we've got a good tool for looking at creating developmentally appropriate sequences for setting up your gym or your soccer field, or, you know, I mean, if you're going to do, like if you work at a recreation center, and in the summer they're going to have a soccer camp, right? How do I set that up so that everybody can be engaged and everybody can make progress and learn, all right? So later on, as I said, later on in the semester, there's a really great tool. I think it's a good tool in the textbook. So we've got to keep in mind that to be proficient at developing maximum force and speed of the ball, we have to obey mechanical principles, all right? It's not an automatic skill, so we've got to teach those principles to someone. And then when we look at older adults, if they have been physically active continually through their life, then it's a pretty stable, kicking is a pretty stable pattern at the level that you're at, right? If you were someone that did a lot of kicking when you were younger, then that pattern is going to be stable. If you weren't so good at kicking, you know, you're going to have to do a lot of work as you get older to get better at kicking. And again, always be considering, what are my constraints, right? What's the equipment I'm going to use? Okay? What are the rules I'm going to set? What's the goal of the task? Where am I setting the skill? Is it on a shiny gym floor? Is it on sand? Is it on grass? Is the grass too long? Or is the grass really short? Right? There's all these kinds of things to consider, as well as the actual person that I'm teaching. Okay? All right, so then there's lots of information on punting. There's lots of video clips about punting. There is a hypothetical developmental sequence and observation plan for punting, which I always find quite interesting, that we have a hypothetical plan for punting but not for kicking. So there must have just been a researcher who really liked the skill of punting for some reason, because I can't think of any other reason why we have that information. Okay, striking. So in their textbook, they split striking into a sidearm strike and an overhead strike, if I remember correctly. So a sidearm strike would be a very basic tennis swing. It would get modified, I guess, for a baseball or a softball swing. In cricket, it's interesting because in cricket, a lot of the cricket shots come here, underhand, unless you're doing a big sweep, and then it would be a sidearm, a modified sidearm strike. So cricket has a couple of different options. Badminton is mostly under or overhead, but you will sometimes see people pick up the shuttlecock at the side if they get to the shuttlecock a bit late. What else have we got that's striking? Table tennis. Yeah, I don't know what to say about table tennis. I don't know. I guess table tennis is a lot of sidearm striking. But because it's a small, very light ball and it's a small paddle and a small table, I'm not sure. I mean, I haven't watched a lot of table tennis recently. I watched a lot when I was at college because we had someone that was on the national team on the course. But they often don't make contact with a straight arm. They're more interested in putting spin on the ball than hitting it. Like, I don't think you see a table tennis player very often hit with a straight arm. But as I said, I haven't watched any in many, 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 many years, and so that may have evolved differently. We talk about tennis in a little while because that's evolved quite differently over the last 10, 15 years. So, sidearm striking, I can use an implement, a racket, a bat, a paddle, or I can use my hand, right? So if I'm working with a beginner, then I probably don't want to give them a full-size tennis racket or a heavy bat, right? And you guys will see over the course of actually if you watched last week's film already, excuse me, if you watched last week's playground film, you'll see that I had the little foam paddles out and the children were striking off the cones. We had that, right, Brian? We had that on the film? Yeah. So we've done a little bit of striking. I also have some soft, squishy, very lightweight baseball type bats that I'll bring out one week. This week we did hockey, which again is not a sidearm strike very often. Can you hear me? Because this is flashing around again. Can you still hear me, Jean?
Yeah, I'm just able to get back on top.
Okay, I'm sorry, I don't know what's going on here. Yeah, you don't see mine is circling, so I don't know if you can hear me. We're reconnecting. Okay, I think I'm back. This week's striking task was hockey. So again, that tends to be quite underhand, unless you're very advanced and you're doing more of a sweep action. But it can be really useful to blow up balloons and have the children tap balloons or hang a balloon from a string, and then they can smack it with their hands. So if you don't have access to nice foam paddles, nice developmentally appropriate foam paddles, use a hand, right? It's the same action. Okay. Okay, so early sidearm striking, I'm going to show you this piece of film. We get a chopping motion, so it's very similar to throwing, right? We tend to see, even though it's meant to be sidearm, we tend to see children chop down onto the ball. So I can't remember whether anyone was doing that last week, because I was all over the place. But if I put the ball on the cone and tell them to hit the ball, if they're really, really beginners, then you'll see them do this rather than this on the ball. And we don't see trunk or foot movement. So it's very, very similar to the first stages of throwing. Let me see if it will let me show you this piece of film. I don't want that one, I want this one. Okay, so here they've got a ball on a string. I really like doing it with a balloon. The kids have loads of fun. Balloons are all kinds of cool colors. Yeah, so I do that. Here's the foam paddle idea. That's so cute. So he's kind of in-betweeny there, but mostly chopping at it. No foot action, right? Now, it's interesting to me, that ball is way too high for him, really. So I wonder if they drop the ball down to around his waist, whether you would see him go at it sideways rather than chopping at it like that, right? I don't think that's set up very well, although it might be that what they were looking for was to show people the chopping action, right? And they knew they'd get that if they put the ball too high. Okay? Okay, back here, uh-oh. Am I circling? No, I think we're okay. All right, so similar to our throwing, we get the chop, then we get the slam. Initially, we don't see any foot action with that sidearm, with that kind of slamming door. And then we start to see taking steps. You'll often see an ipsilateral step before a contralateral step. And I'll come back to that idea in a minute, all right? Because that's quite interesting now with the way that, and I only know about tennis because I watch heaps of tennis. Let's see if I can show you the change here. All right. So although he hasn't taken a step exactly, because of the way this is set up, and he's hitting a ball that's just kind of hanging there for him, you can see he is side on to the ball, and he has his opposite leg right. So you can see the change there between those two pieces of video. Oh, why can't it just go back where we were? Why does it make me do this every time? Okay, so proficient sidearm striking, they would call that young boy intermediate. It would be interesting to have had a comparison of him hitting the ball on the string and him hitting a ball that was thrown or hit to him. because obviously hitting the ball on the string isn't a real world activity. So, now when you look at sidearm striking, I think this is quite interesting because to me it feels a little bit out of date, the literature on sidearm striking. So when I was in school, many, many moons ago, when we had tennis, the cues were step sideways, take the racket back, sweep the racket across the table to hit the ball, right? So from here, step, sweep, right? And that was how you hit a tennis forehand. And basically the same with a backhand. Step, sweep, right? And if you watch tennis players at that point in time, so in the early 70s, that's what forehands and backhands mostly look like, right? But if you watch tennis players now, that they don't look like that. They don't, like, stepping in opposition's no longer the rule, right? They very often step ipsilaterally and hit the ball with an open stance, right? This whole keeping the racket horizontal thing, out the window, right? The racket can start down here and finish up here, or it can start here and chop under the ball. It's all over the place now. So to me, when we look at the developmental changes, where we stop that it was considered proficient, in my view, and I don't have any research to back this up, this is just my opinion, I don't think what our book calls proficient is the end of the picture anymore, right? Because even if you watch young children playing tennis, so like the USTA has a junior tennis program where they have, the court is slightly smaller, the net is a little bit lower, the rackets are shorter and lighter. If you watch those kids play, they don't do step, swing, right? Their tennis strokes look like they're here, they're here, they're here, right? They're all over the place. So I have a bit of a beef about the striking stuff because to me it just seems a bit out of date. But as I say, I don't have any research to back that up. I just watch a lot of tennis. I don't play as much as I should, but I do watch a lot. So, having said all that, when we're looking at early striking, we can use the sequences for the foot action and the trunk action from our overarm throw developmental sequences and observation plan. All right? And so when we're looking at the trunk move, we're going to have no trunk rotation. We're going to have that blocked rotation idea where the whole body goes in one piece. And then we should see some differentiated rotation. All right? Particularly if you're looking at baseball. I don't know enough about softball, but you know, I mean, if you think about watching a really good batter, right? Then their hips go, then their trunk goes, and then their shoulders and their arms go, I think. I'm relying on you here, Ryan. Is that right? You're engrossed over there. Right? What happens in softball?
Same, pretty much.
Same?
It's a little different, but it's pretty similar.
Because they're coming off a completely different pitch, aren't they? Is the pitch lower for them?
I mean,
Or is it rising as it gets to them?
sometimes, yeah. But like the swing itself doesn't really change.
Doesn't change. The plane of the swing, so what they mean by that is progresses from vertical to horizontal, is it's coming from this chopping action to the slamming action. Okay? Grip, so again, grip. Do you have a power grip where you're holding on here, or do you have something where the thumb is a little more mobile? Elbows are away, but they're not always, right? Some of the best tennis players in the world have played here, which is really weird, because it doesn't imagine how good they would have been if that pattern had been altered to be more mechanically efficient, right? Monica Seles hit the ball a lot of the time with bent arms, right? She hit the ball really hard, so goodness knows what would have happened if they had been able to get her arms straight. Okay, so these slides are the developmental sequence. So if you look at page 118, that's your developmental sequence. Now we've got, you can use some of those components from the overarm throwing observation plan. And they also provide an observation plan just for the racket action. So let me find that to show you. Where is it? I can't see it. No, I don't want that. Oh, poop. All right, I can't find it. Why isn't it there? I've got them open to show you. Why won't it let me share the photos? All right, I'm sorry. It's not going to let me do that. I don't know what I did wrong there. So if you look at page 119, they have the observation plan, the yes-no questions for the racket bat action. Okay, so you can use that and the foot and the trunk action from throwing as your observation plan for sidearm striking. I'll show you that. I don't know why that's not there. Okay. Sorry. Okay, then overarm striking. So volleyball serving is an overarm strike. A tennis serve is an overarm strike. Badminton has a lot of overarm striking. I can't think of anything else at the moment. So again, you can do the strike just with your hand or with a racket of some kind. Okay? So, limited trunk rotation, all similar, very, very similar characteristics through all these types of ballistic skills. Swing with a collapsed elbow. So that links back to this idea of having the longest radius of rotation at the point of contact, right? So if I hit the ball with my arm bent, I can't apply as much force as if I hit the ball here, right? They're also looking for some kind of lag in the forearm, and again looks maybe a little bit like early throwing, so we might see some chopping type actions instead of a throw and a reach. So then we start to see with more practice, with more modeling, with more good coaching feedback, we start to see some rotation. We should get, bent on the swing, bent and straight as it hits the ball, all right? So they do have a developmental sequence for overarm striking, which is on page 122. And they have 5 components. They use trunk action, elbow action, spinal range of motion, pelvic range of motion, so this rotation idea, and then the racket action. Interestingly, they do not convert the developmental sequence into an observation plan. So that might be a good practice skill for you. Rather than go straight into the obs plan that has to be handed in, you can practice creating an observation plan from this developmental sequence, because they just haven't provided that. And I don't know if that's an error. I need to go back to the previous edition. I don't remember the observation plan being missing in the previous edition. So I need to go back and have a look at that and see whether that's an error on the publisher's part or whether they just didn't include that this time around. Any questions, Jean, so far? So we've got trunk action, elbow action, rotation, racket action for overarm striking. So depending on whether you split the trunk and the pelvic range of motion up, we've got 4 or 5 components here for overarm striking. Okay. Now again, I don't know why you're looking at a golfing shot as overarm striking. That isn't overarm striking. So I think the take-home message here is there's very, very little research on any kind of striking pattern in older adults. So they've resorted to a golf study, even though that's not under overarm striking. So they've got good accuracy in golf shots with older adults. Remember that they're losing type 2 muscle fibers, so they may have to exert more force or as much force as they can using different muscle fiber types. But relatively accurate. The next study is more relevant given the conversation that we've been having, in my view. So they looked at some older people who play tennis. So when you think about the older population, think about what are the kinds of activities that we see them take part in, right? They don't play football. They may be throwing and catching a football in the park or in the back garden with their grandchildren, but they don't play football. I would have said they don't play basketball, except that, well, not this semester, but there is typically a group of faculty and staff that play basketball every lunchtime here. And some of them are some of the older faculty members. So maybe they do continue to play basketball. Again, can at least be throwing baskets, right? But tennis and golf, hiking, riding bicycles, right? These are lifetime activities that we see people doing, and that's why we have the research on golfing and tennis, because that's what older people do, right? Looking at tennis players as they get older, they looked at serving and found pretty decent levels of movement patterns there. So, you know, kind of maybe not elite and backing off of proficient, but certainly not elementary, not beginner levels. Unfortunately, in this particular study, they used older adults who had, when they were younger, been actual professional tennis players, or at least teaching pros at a tennis club. So I'm not sure that that's a realistic population to take a judgment call on what does the developmental trend look like, right? Because they weren't typical adults. All right, so overall picture then when we're looking at this chapter, all right? If we have developmental sequences, or we can create our own developmental sequences, we can use those as a checklist. So I can assess, I can work out where this person is. That means I can provide developmentally appropriate tuition to move them to the next level. Right? Remember, we can't jump levels. So there's no point in me coaching and teaching this if what I have is this. Right? We've got to be able to understand what's the next thing that's going to happen. That's the thing I want to coach. Right? And then when I get that, I pick the next thing that's going to happen. Okay? So when we're assessing, you can say, if you give them, lost you again. I didn't lose you, I think you lost me. Jean, can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am. Seems like you're bad.
Okay, good, because it just said that I couldn't reconnect, so I'm like, wait, am I connected? Am I not connected? Okay, all right. So I let's try to do this quickly. If you give, like on the TGMD, they get 2 trials, not very many. Quite often when you're running motor skill assessments, you're going to give them 5 trials or 10 trials. If on the majority of the trials you see the pattern, so let's say 7 out of 10 times I see them step in opposition, I would give them stepping in opposition, even though on 3 of the trials they stepped ipsilaterally. Right? So it's just use your common sense, really. It's really important that you observe motor skills from the appropriate position. So you're looking as much as possible to be at right angles to the plane of motion. Right? So do I need to stand side on? Do I need to stand front or back on to see the particular action, which component am I looking at? All right? So the sequence, the developmental sequence, these steps that we take are tied to mechanical principles. It's the brain's way of learning the mechanical principle and learning how to apply it to the skill. Right? It's not necessarily cognitive, because there's all this unconscious feedback and sensory information that the brain is receiving for it to adjust movement patterns unconsciously. Okay? We're going to look for stepping in opposition often, depending on the skill. We want differentiated rotation of the hips, the trunk, and the shoulders. Right? We want more lag on whichever bit of the body is doing the projecting of the object. Okay? It's important to understand these skills are not automatic. It's not like walking or even running, right? Which are, and even jumping to some extent, right? Our locomotor skills are much more hardwired up to a point than our object control skills are. So a typically developing, because we saw individuals who were not typically developing, right? Typically developing child will stand up on 2 feet. They will walk with 50% phasing. They will run in some version with 50% phasing. They will probably jump, right? Without encouragement, without too much modeling, without, right? This stuff, striking, right? Throwing, anything to do with object control, this doesn't happen automatically. It has to be modeled, it has to be encouraged, it has to have good teaching, right? So that means that when we look at adults, many adults don't have competency even, let alone proficiency, right? They're not even competent at some of these right? Competent at some of these object control skills, let alone proficient, okay? Because we just didn't do enough of them when we were younger. And the older we get, the harder. It's not that I can't improve my tennis. If I made the effort to go and play tennis more often, I would get better, right? If I went on a tennis camp, I would get better. Would I become really good? No, right? But I can improve, and that's always satisfying, right? The coordination of ballistic skills seems to be relatively stable across the lifespan, right? So it's not coordination that impacts what an older person does in a ballistic type skill. It's lack of type 2 muscle fibers, right? It's lack of range of motion, Okay, it's structural things that are going on. There you've gone again. Can you still hear me? We haven't had this since that first week. Because it's midterms. Everybody's using Blackboard.
Yeah.
Hello, are we back?
We're back.
I think it's a good job we're at the end. I'm assuming we're having this problem because it's midterms and everybody's on Blackboard today. So the coordination of these, what they are calling ballistic movements in this chapter, isn't the factor that goes wrong as we get older, right? So when we watch older adults and their movement pattern is changing and possibly deteriorating a little bit, it's much more to do with structural changes that are going on, right? Arthritis that limits the range of motion, loss of strength because of loss of type 2 muscle fibers, and those kinds of things. It's not the coordination of the skill that goes squiffy, okay? Ta-da! We're done with chapter 6. Questions, Jean? Comments?
Not really. The
No.
only thing we have due soon is the playground analysis, correct?
Sorry, say that again?
The only thing that we will have due, like soon, is the playground analysis.
Yeah, it's not due soon, but I would do, the problem is, as long as I can get out onto the playground, there's going to be one every week. So if you don't keep up with them every week, you're going to have a very unhappy time later on, right? So, I mean, you technically aren't joining me for lab anymore at the moment. So you've got an hour on Wednesday and an hour on Friday to analyze the video I put up this morning. So do you have to do it Wednesday and Friday? No. But if you don't, you're not going to have a very happy time in a few weeks. Trying to catch up.
And we're just watching the video and just describing what we see in the video.
Yeah, look at the guidelines. You've got to pick 3 things, right, that you see on the video that relate to the PowerPoints and the course packet notes that we talked about earlier in the semester. So you've got to identify 3 things from all that information that we covered. So there's lots of choices there about what to identify, right? You've got to explain what they are and then tell me if you were on the playground and that's what you saw, what would you do? What would your response to seeing that be, right? So have a closer look at it. Here's my suggestion. Sorry, I didn't mean to be bossy. This is my suggestion. Tomorrow morning, have a look at it. Look at the guidelines, look at the film, look at the notes. And then I have office hours tomorrow afternoon at 3:15. If having looked at it in the morning, you're like, jump into office hours and we can have a chat.
Sounds good.
Okay? But it will be difficult to talk about it if you haven't actually given it a go and looked at it. Because the questions will be too vague. I won't be able to be specific for you. Okay?
All right, so tomorrow, office hours, 3 o'clock,
3:15.
3:15.
Yeah.
We'll do.
Okay. And then what day is today?
Tuesday.
Tuesday. Thursday, we'll start the next bit of object control skills, which they call manipulative skills. All right? Okay, I'm going to skedaddle, and maybe I'll talk to you tomorrow.
All right, have a great rest of your day, Dr. Owen.
And you, and you.